A few years ago my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote forest. We were excited to reconnect and enjoy nature. It was early summer, and the weather was perfect for a weekend away from the city. Our group consisted of me, Jake, Lisa, and Tom. We had been friends since high school, and this trip was our way of catching up. After busy months of work and life, we packed our gear and drove out to the forest on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, but the scene was beautiful as we got deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in a soft green glow. We finally reached our campsite, a small clearing near a quiet stream. We set up our tents and built a campfire. The air was filled with the smell of pine and fresh earth. That first night we sat around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows among the trees. We laughed and reminisced about old-time times. Everything felt perfect, almost magical. After a while we decided to go to bed, tired from the long day and looking forward to exploring the forest the next day. The next morning I woke up early. The sun was just rising, casting a golden light over the campsite. I noticed that Jake's tent was empty. At first I thought he might have gone for a walk or to the stream for some water, but as time passed and he didn't return, we started to get worried. Where could Jake be? Lisa asked, her voice tined with concern. Tom suggested we split up and search for him. We agreed and set off in different directions, calling out his name. I headed towards the stream where we often spent time in the past. The forest was quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. As I approached the stream I saw something strange. Jake's backpack was lying on the ground, but there was no sign of him. I called out for him again, but there was no answer. I picked up the backpack and returned to the campsite. Lisa and Tom were already there, looking worried. Did you find anything? Tom asked. I showed them the backpack. I found this by the stream, but there's no sign of Jake. We decided to search the forest more thoroughly. We marked our campsite with bright ribbons and ventured deeper into the woods. As we walked we noticed something odd. The forest felt different, almost alive. The trees seemed to close in around us and the air grew thick and heavy. We came across another clearing smaller than our campsite. In the center was a circle of stones, and within the circle the ground was bare, as if nothing had ever grown there. It felt eerie, but we didn't have time to ponder it. We continued our search, calling out for Jake. By the time the sun began to set we still hadn't found him. We returned to our campsite exhausted and scared. That night strange things began to happen. Personal belongings started disappearing. Lisa's flashlight, Tom's jacket, and even some of our food were missing. We heard eerie sounds, whispers in the wind and footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. As the night wore on we saw glimpses of Jake in the distance. He looked different, almost ghostly. He would appear for a moment and then vanish into the darkness. We tried to follow him, but he always slipped away. The next morning we were even more determined to find out what was happening. We remembered hearing an old legend about this forest, stories about people vanishing without a trace. According to the legend, the forest was haunted by spirits who lured people away and trapped them forever. We decided to find out more. We searched for any clues that might explain the strange occurrences. We found old carvings on the trees, symbols we didn't understand. We also found a hidden path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest, a path that felt ancient and forbidden. As we followed the path the forest grew darker and colder. We felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but we pressed on. The path led us to a large ancient tree. Its roots were gnarled and twisted, and its branches stretched out like skeletal arms. In front of the tree was a small wooden cabin, half hidden by the underbrush. We approached the cabin cautiously. The door creaked open, and inside we found signs of recent activity. There were empty food cans, a makeshift bed, and more of those strange symbols carved into the walls. Suddenly we heard a noise behind us. We turned to see Jake standing there, but he wasn't the same. His eyes were vacant and he moved stiffly like a puppet on strings. Jake, is that you? Lisa asked, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead he started to walk towards us, his movements jerky and unnatural. We backed away, fear gripping our hearts. It was then that we realized the forest had taken him and he was no longer our friend. We ran back to the campsite, our minds racing. We had to get out of the forest before it took us to. We grabbed our belongings and started packing up, but as we were about To leave, we heard the whispers again, closer. This time we didn't look back. We ran through the forest, following the ribbons we had tied to the trees. The forest seemed to fight against us, branches snagging our clothes and roots tripping our steps, but we didn't stop. We could feel the presence of the forest closing in on us. Finally we broke through the tree line and reached our car. We jumped in and Tom started the engine. As we drove away, we saw Jake standing at the edge of the forest watching us. With those vacant eyes, we didn't stop until we were miles away, back in the safety of the city. We never spoke of that trip again. The forest had taken something from us, something we could never get back. We had gone there to reconnect and enjoy nature, but we left forever changed, haunted by the memory of what we had. In the heart of autumn, when the leaves are a fiery mosaic and the days grow short, the hollow woods came alive with a haunting whisper. The small town of Alabaster sat on the edge of the forest, a place where the locals spoke in hushed tones about things best left unsaid. It was a forest that drew in the curious and the foolhardy, and it was there that the horrors began. Sarah Caldwell had heard the stories. She had grown up with them, stories of people who had wandered into the hollow woods and never returned. The most chilling was the tale of the veil, a spectral fog that rose from the forest floor and trapped those who ventured too deep. Despite the warnings, Sarah felt an irresistible pull toward the forest, an urge to uncover the truth behind the legends. On the day she chose to enter, the sky was an oppressive gray, and a chilling wind whispered through the trees. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a sense of determination, Sarah stepped past the boundary where the well-worn path ended and the forest swallowed the light. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches forming dark arches overhead. As she ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around her. The ground was uneven, littered with gnarled roots and fallen leaves that rustled with an unsettling sound. The air grew colder, and the mist began to thicken, curling around her ankles like spectral fingers. It was then that she noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no rustling of small creatures. Just the oppressive silence. After hours of walking, Sarah's flashlight flickered ominously. She adjusted the beam, and the shadows seemed to dance on the edges of her vision. An inexplicable dread gnawed at her insides, but she pressed on, driven by an almost primal need to uncover the truth. It was then that she saw it, a dilapidated cabin, almost swallowed by the forest. Its roof was caved in, and the windows were dark voids. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and curiosity. She approached cautiously, the creaking of the wooden floorboards underfoot echoing eerily in the silence. Inside, the cabin was a morbid tableau of decay. Dust-covered furniture was strewn about, and old, yellowed newspapers lay in heaps. But it was the wall that caught her attention. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood was a series of frantic, jagged symbols and messages. The veil is coming, they are watching, and most chillingly, escape is not possible. Sarah's pulse raced as she realized the gravity of her situation. The air grew colder still, and the mist seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin. The oppressive feeling intensified, and she felt eyes on her, watching from the shadows. She turned to leave, but the door creaked shut behind her with a finality that made her blood run cold. In the dim light, she noticed a strange, rhythmic sound, a low, droning hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The mist had thickened to the point where visibility was reduced to mere feet. As she moved toward the door, the mist began to swirl, coalescing into vague, shifting shapes. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled with the door. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Panic set in, and she backed away, stumbling over the debris. The mist was now swirling aggressively, forming ghostly faces that seemed to leer and wail with silent agony. The hum grew louder, and the mist seemed to pulse with an almost sentient rhythm. The whispers returned, clearer now, weaving a tapestry of torment and despair. "Welcome to the veil," they seemed to say. "You are ours now." Desperate, Sarah grabbed her flashlight and swung it around wildly, but the beam only cut through the mist in fleeting, jagged slices. The oppressive fog thickened, and the cabin walls began to close in on her, warping and bending as though the forest itself was alive and hungry. Then, in a flash of insight, she remembered the stories. There was no escape from the veil. It was a trap, a prison of the forest's making. The mist was not just a physical barrier but a barrier of the mind, a veil that twisted reality and ensnared the soul. With a final, defiant cry, Sarah hurled her flashlight at the mist, shattering the fragile silence. The impact seemed to tear through the veil for a brief moment, and she glimpsed a sliver of the outside world, bright, clear, and unreachable. The mist surged, engulfing her completely. The next morning, when the sun rose over Alabaster, it cast a mournful light on the hollow woods. The cabin stood empty, the mist dissipated as if it had never been. Sarah Caldwell was never found. Her disappearance was another addition to the lore of the forest, a new whisper in the wind. I love camping. Being out in nature always makes me feel free and alive. This summer I decided to camp by the lake where my family used to go when I was a kid. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and filled with clear water. The sound of birds and the smell of pine always brought back good memories. My father used to take me here. He loved this place. We would fish, swim, and tell stories by the campfire. But my father passed away 5 years ago, and it was hard for me to come back to this place. Without him, I missed him so much. I arrived at the lake in the afternoon. The sun was shining and the sky was clear. I set up my tent near the water and gathered some wood for a fire. Later I wanted to cook dinner and enjoy the peaceful evening. As the sun started to set, I lit the fire and cooked some fish I had caught earlier. The smell of the cooking fish filled the air, and it reminded me of the times my father and I cooked together. After dinner, I sat by the fire looking at the stars. The night was calm and the lake was still. I could hear the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore. It was a perfect night, but as I stared into the fire I felt a strange chill. It was a sudden coldness that made me shiver. I looked around, but there was nothing unusual. I decided to take a walk by the lake to clear my head. The moon was bright, casting a silver light on the water. The trees cast long shadows, and the path was lit just enough for me to see where I was going. As I walked, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was just my imagination, and I kept walking. I reached the spot where my father and I used to fish. I stood there looking at the water, remembering the good times we had. Suddenly I saw something on the other side of the lake. It looked like a person standing by the water. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted my eyes to see better, and my blood ran cold. It was my father. He was standing there looking at me. He wore the same clothes he always wore when we went fishing, a plaid shirt and old jeans. His face was pale and his eyes looked sad. I froze. This couldn't be real. My father was dead. I closed my eyes and shook my head, hoping he would disappear. When I opened my eyes, he was still there staring at me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the ghostly figure of my father. He raised his hand slowly and pointed to the water. My mind was racing. What did he want? Why was he here? Gathering all my courage, I took a step forward, then another. Slowly, I walked around the lake towards him. My heart was pounding and my breath was shallow. As I got closer, I could see him more clearly. His eyes seemed to follow my every move. When I was just a few feet away, he lowered his hand and looked at the water again. I followed his gaze and saw something floating in the water. It looked like an old wooden box. I looked back at my father, but he was gone, vanished into thin air. My legs felt weak and I almost fell. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get that box. I waded into the water, the coldness biting at my skin. The box was heavier than I expected, but I managed to drag it to the shore. I sat down, soaked and shivering, and opened the box. Inside I found old photos, letters, and a fishing lure that belonged to my father. Tears filled my eyes as I looked through the items. These were memories, pieces of my past that I thought were lost forever. Among the letters, I found one addressed to me. It was in my father's handwriting. My dear son, if you are reading this, it means you have found the box. I hid it here because I wanted you to have these memories. They are a part of who we are and a part of our time together. I love you and I am always with you, even if you can't see me. Take care of yourself. And remember the good times we had. The lake will always be a special place for us. Love, Dad. I sat there clutching the letter, tears streaming down my face. My father had reached out to me from beyond the grave to give me this gift. I felt a sense of peace knowing he was watching over me. The fear and confusion melted away, replaced by a warm feeling of love and connection. I spent the rest of the night by the fire looking through the photos and letters, remembering my father and the times we shared. The lake was still and quiet, and the stars twinkled above. I knew that my father was still with me in spirit, and that he would always be a part of my life. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, I packed up my things and prepared to leave. I took one last look at the water, grateful for the experience. As I walked away, I felt a gentle breeze, as if my father was saying goodbye. I knew I would come back to this place again. The lake held our memories, and now it also had part of my father's spirit. I used to go camping all the time with some of my buddies from college, but once we graduated we could never find time anymore. Everyone's schedules were different, so I ended up going out on my own. There was a camping ground that we used to go to a lot, so I played it safe and went to that same place. It was somewhat far out and not the easiest to get to, but that's why I liked it. Nobody would ever be there because there were a lot of easier options nearby to camp at. Knowing the route, I got there no problem and set all of my stuff up. Not long after though, a man showed up. He looked like any other hiker, but he only had a small backpack, so definitely no tent or camping gear. The only thing that had me questioning why he was here was that this wasn't a very scenic spot or anything. It was a nice place to camp because it was an open area with trees around, but if you're not camping then there would be no reason to hike all the way out here. I didn't think all that much about it at the time because the man seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted a quiet space to relax for a bit. I stayed by my tent and the man stayed on the other side of the campgrounds. Around 6 I walked away from my tent to cook my food, and it was around this time that I saw the man finally leave. I thought it was a little late to be walking back because it was going to be completely dark in less than an hour and the hike was probably 3 hours. Other than that, I was just happy to be alone. Now I boiled some water with my mini stove and made one of my freeze-dried meals, then went back near my tent and sat down. The sun was just about gone, so I brought out a small lantern and hung it on the side of the tent. As I stayed outside and took in the atmosphere, it suddenly hit me that I was alone out there, and that usually this is when we'd all gather around and talk by a campfire, but by myself I didn't really have anything to do. After a while I turned off the lantern and went inside my tent, laying down and turning in for the night. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up to the sound of footsteps nearby. When I opened my eyes it was pitch black and I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for, but the footsteps came closer and closer until they stopped on the other end of the campground. After a few seconds I felt around for my lantern and turned it on, then unzipped the tent and looked out. 20 or so feet from my tent there was the shape of a man standing right by where I'd seen the guy from earlier standing, and from what I can make out it was likely the same person, but they were just standing there not doing anything. It was far enough into the night that this was immediately disturbing no matter the context, and having turned my lantern on he definitely saw me. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out to him. I waited a couple seconds, but he didn't show any signs of acknowledging me. I couldn't even tell which direction he was facing, but he was either facing away from me or directly at me, and I don't even know which way was more disturbing. I reached for my pocket knife from my backpack, then did the only thing I could do, which was stay sitting there and wait. The most increasingly uneasy 15 minutes of my life passed as I looked at this man standing there and barely moved before he suddenly turned and walked off in the same direction he had gone before, and I could see from the way his figure moved when he turned that he had been facing me, so that whole time he was there he was just staring at me. I felt chills run through me as the man's footsteps got quieter and quieter, fading out in the distance. I didn't know what else to do other than stay up in case he came back, and as far as I know he never did. I left in the morning and got back safely, but since then I haven't been out camping. I don't know what that man was doing, but there's no world in which that wasn't extremely disturbing. Maybe I scared him off by waking up and watching him to make sure he didn't do anything, but that just terrifies me to think about. If I hadn't woken up